The purple-orange sunset bled across the Montana sky as the stagecoach rattled into Opal, a dust-choked frontier town where Sophie Graham clutched her single valise with trembling fingers, her left eye swollen shut beneath the brim of her bonnet. April 1875 had arrived with cruel winds, and Sophie had arrived with little more than a marriage contract and the fading bruise that told a story she wished to forget. The stagecoach driver called out, "Opal Station, end of the line," as the horses slowed to a halt before the town's only hotel. Sophie adjusted her bonnet, attempting to hide the worst of her injury, but she knew it was futile. Her correspondence with Yates Irving had been filled with poetic promises and gentle words, but now she feared his reaction to her marred appearance. Would he reject her on sight? Send her back east on the next available coach? As she descended from the stagecoach, her boots touching Montana soil for the first time, dust swirled around her gray traveling dress. Sophie spotted a tall figure leaning against a hitching post, tan Stetson pulled low over his eyes, leather vest worn but well-maintained over a cotton shirt. When he straightened, her heart stuttered with recognition. This must be him. "Miss Graham?" His voice was deeper than she'd imagined from his letters, a pleasant baritone that carried easily across the station platform. "Mr. Irving?" Sophie responded, keeping her face angled away, prolonging the inevitable moment when he would see her injury. Yates approached with confident strides, his spurs jingling with each step. When he reached her, he removed his hat in a gesture of respect, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of well-worn saddle leather. His expression shifted immediately upon noticing her face, and Sophie braced herself for disgust or rejection. Instead, he placed his hat over his heart, his eyes filling not with repulsion, but with a protective anger that surprised her. "Miss Graham," he said, his voice gentle despite the tension in his jaw. "Who did this to you?" Sophie's carefully rehearsed explanations died on her lips. She had planned to blame a mishap during the journey, a fall from the coach during a rest stop, anything but the truth. Yet something in his direct gaze compelled honesty. "My former employer's son," she admitted quietly. "He did not appreciate my departure." Yates nodded once, a muscle working in his jaw. Then, to her astonishment, he extended his hand. "Sophie Graham, I made you a promise in those letters, and I intend to keep it. If you'll still have me, you have my word. The only marks you'll ever bear in this house will be kisses." The tenderness in his declaration, spoken without hesitation before the curious onlookers at the station, brought unexpected tears to Sophie's good eye. She placed her gloved hand in his. "I would be honored, Mr. Irving." "Yates," he corrected gently, taking her valise. "My ranch is a few miles outside of town. I've arranged a room for you at the hotel tonight. The church is expecting us tomorrow at noon, but only if you're certain." He paused, studying her face. "You're under no obligation, Sophie. Not after what you've endured to get here." Sophie felt something unfamiliar unfurl in her chest, not relief exactly, but the tentative flutter of hope. "I made a promise as well, Mr. Yates. I intend to honor it." As they walked toward the hotel, Sophie noticed the curious stares of townspeople. A woman with a black eye, arriving on the stage to meet Yates Irving, the gossip would spread like wildfire before sunset. "Don't mind them," Yates said quietly. "Opal's a small place. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." The hotel was modest but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and creaking wooden floors. Mrs. Abernathy, the proprietress, looked sympathetically at Sophie's face, but asked no questions as she handed over a room key. "Supper's at 6 sharp, the older woman said. "We're serving venison stew tonight." "I'll return at 6 to escort you to dinner," Yates said as they reached her door. "Unless you'd prefer to rest?" "I would welcome the company," Sophie admitted. After days of traveling with strangers who either stared too much or pointedly looked away, the prospect of a meal with her future husband, a man who had shown nothing but kindness, despite her condition, was deeply appealing. Alone in her room, Sophie unpacked her few belongings and examined her face in the small mirror above the wash basin. The bruise had yellowed around the edges, the swelling less pronounced than it had been 3 days ago when she'd boarded the train in Philadelphia. She gently dabbed cool water around the injury, wincing slightly. The brutal attack had occurred the night before her departure. Richard Blackwell, her employer's son, had cornered her in the servants' quarters after learning of her plans to leave. "No one leaves me," he'd snarled, his breath heavy with whiskey as his fist had connected with her face. Only the intervention of the cook had prevented worse, but Sophie had fled the next morning with her eye swollen shut and her resolve hardened. Her correspondence with Yates Irving had begun 6 months earlier, after she'd placed an advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper. His letters had been thoughtful and direct, describing his ranch, his life in Montana Territory, and his desire for a partnership based on mutual respect. Unlike other responses she'd received, he'd never once mentioned her appearance or demanded a photograph. A gentle knock at 6 o'clock sharp pulled Sophie from her thoughts. She adjusted her hair, arranging it to partially shield her injured eye, and opened the door to find Yates waiting, hat in hand, having changed into a clean shirt. "You look lovely," he said simply. "You're kind to say so, though we both know it isn't true at present." Yates shook his head. "I found that truth often depends on perspective, Sophie. From where I stand, I see a brave woman who traveled across the country to meet a stranger, despite carrying a painful reminder of what she left behind. That's a particular kind of beauty that has nothing to do with a temporary injury." His words warmed her in places long gone cold, and Sophie allowed him to offer his arm as they descended to the dining room. Conversation flowed more easily than Sophie had anticipated during their meal. Yates spoke of his ranch, the 100 acres he'd purchased 5 years ago after working as a ranch hand for nearly a decade. He described the 2-bedroom cabin he'd built himself, the small herd of cattle he was gradually expanding, and his hopes to add horses to his stock within the next year. "It's not much compared to what you might be accustomed to in Philadelphia," he admitted, "but it's good land with clean water. The winters are harsh, but the summers make up for it." "I was a lady's maid, not the lady herself," Sophie reminded him with a small smile. "My accommodations were a narrow bed in a shared attic room. Your cabin sounds like a palace in comparison." "And your skills?" Yates asked. "Your letters mentioned experience with household management." Sophie nodded, appreciating his practical approach. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage accounts. Mrs. Blackwell insisted her household staff be versatile. I also have some experience with basic medical care. She suffered from frequent headaches and required special attention." "Those are valuable skills on a ranch," Yates said approvingly. "Though I should tell you that I don't expect a servant. A wife is a partner, at least in my understanding." The word wife sent a flutter through Sophie's stomach. Tomorrow, this man would be her husband. They would share a home, a name, a bed. The thought brought both trepidation and a strange anticipation. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates leaned forward slightly. "I meant what I said earlier, Sophie. I won't rush you into any aspect of marriage you're not ready for. We have time to become acquainted properly." His consideration nearly undid her. After years of service where her preferences were irrelevant, to be treated with such respect felt almost disorienting. "Thank you," she managed, "though I would not want you to regret your choice." "I won't," he said with quiet confidence. "Will you tell me about yourself? Your letters were informative, but reserved." Sophie hesitated before sharing carefully selected parts of her past, growing up in an orphanage in Boston until age 13, her apprenticeship to a seamstress who had later recommended her for service in the Blackwell household, her 7 years in Philadelphia. She omitted Richard Blackwell's increasing attention over the past year, his unwanted touches and threats, the final violent confrontation that had left her marked. "And what of your family?" she asked, turning the conversation toward Yates. A shadow crossed his features. "My parents died of fever when I was 16. I have a younger sister, Clara, who married a shopkeeper in Helena last year. Other than that, it's just me." He paused. "And you now, if you still wish it after tonight." "I do," Sophie said with more certainty than she'd felt since leaving Philadelphia. After dinner, Yates escorted her back to her room, maintaining a respectful distance. "The ceremony is at noon," he reminded her, "but I'll understand if you change your mind. The stage heads east on Thursday." "I won't change my mind," Sophie assured him. Yates studied her face for a moment, then reached slowly, telegraphing his movement to brush a strand of hair from her uninjured cheek. "Until tomorrow, then." Alone in her room, Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the spot where Yates had touched her. Such a small gesture, yet it had sent warmth cascading through her. How strange that the prospect of marrying a man she'd only just met in person felt safer than returning to the life she'd known. Sleep came fitfully that night, dreams of Richard Blackwell's rage intermingling with images of Yates Irving's gentle eyes. When morning light filtered through the thin curtains, Sophie rose and prepared herself as best she could. Her wedding dress was simple, a blue cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the nicest garment she owned. The bruise around her eye had faded slightly overnight, though it remained starkly visible against her pale skin. At precisely 11:30, a knock at her door announced Yates's arrival. When she opened it, she found him in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "For you," he said, extending the flowers. "They're not much, but the planes are just starting to bloom." Sophie accepted them with genuine pleasure. "They're beautiful." "Thank you." "Are you certain about today?" Yates asked as they descended the hotel stairs. "I won't hold you to anything if you've had second thoughts." "I'm certain," Sophie said firmly. "Are you?" A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "More certain than I've been about most things in my life." The church was small but well maintained, with polished wooden pews and sunlight streaming through simple glass windows. Reverend Mitchell greeted them warmly, though Sophie noticed his concerned glance at her eye. Two of Yates's neighbors, the Thompsons, served as witnesses. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Sophie listened to Yates's clear, steady voice as he recited his vows, his eyes never leaving hers despite the marring bruise. When it came her turn, she spoke with more confidence than she'd expected to feel, promising herself to this man who had shown her more kindness in one day than she'd experienced in years. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mitchell declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Irving." Yates hesitated, his eyes asking permission. When Sophie nodded slightly, he leaned forward and pressed the gentlest of kisses to her lips, brief, respectful, yet somehow stirring something deep within her that had long lain dormant. After signing the marriage certificate, they thanked the witnesses and stepped out into the Montana sunshine as husband and wife. Sophie Irving. The name felt strange and new, an identity untouched by the shadows of her past. "I have a few supplies to collect before we head to the ranch," Yates explained as he helped her into his wagon. "Would you mind stopping at the general store?" "Of course not," Sophie replied, settling beside him on the wooden seat. As they made their way down Opal's main street, Sophie became acutely aware of the curious stares directed their way. Whispers followed them like ripples in water. When they reached the general store, Yates helped her down from the wagon, his hand warm and steady on hers. Inside, the storekeeper, a portly man with a bushy mustache, greeted Yates with familiarity. "So the rumors are true. Congratulations on your nuptials, Irving." "Thank you, Henderson. This is my wife, Sophie." The word wife still caused that flutter in Sophie's chest. "Pleasure, madam," Henderson said, his eyes lingering briefly on her bruise before he quickly looked away. "What can I get for you folks today?" As Yates listed their needs, flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition for his rifle, nails for a project at the ranch, a woman approached Sophie. Gray-haired and sharp-eyed, she introduced herself as Harriet Peterson. "My husband and I run the farm adjacent to Yates's property," she explained. "I wanted to welcome you to Opal." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," Sophie replied cautiously. The older woman lowered her voice. "I also wanted to say that Yates Irving is a good man. One of the best in these parts. Whatever happened before? Her eyes flicked meaningfully to Sophie's bruise. Well, you're safe now. Before Sophie could respond, Harriet continued, I host a ladies' sewing circle every other Wednesday. You'd be welcome to join us once you're settled. The simple gesture of inclusion brought unexpected emotion to Sophie's throat. I would like that very much. By the time Yates had completed his purchases, Sophie found herself looking forward to seeing the ranch that would now be her home. They loaded the supplies into the wagon and set off, leaving Opal behind as they traveled into the rolling grasslands. It's about 5 miles, Yates explained as they rode, not too far from town, but far enough for privacy. The landscape opened before them, vast and golden under the spring sun, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional tree. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in April. It's beautiful, Sophie breathed, taking in the expansive sky that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. It can be harsh, Yates cautioned, but yes, I've always found beauty in it, even in winter when everything lies under snow. When they crested a small hill, Yates pointed ahead. There, that's our home. The cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees, a small stream curving around the property. It was larger than Sophie had expected, solidly built with a covered porch spanning the front. A corral stood to one side, containing 3 horses, while a small herd of cattle grazed in a fenced pasture beyond. A barn and what appeared to be a chicken coop completed the picture. You built this yourself? Sophie asked, impressed by the evident care that had gone into the construction. With help from neighbors for the raising, Yates confirmed. But yes, I designed it and did most of the work. I wanted something that would last. As they approached, Sophie noticed flower beds flanking the porch steps, though they contained only the first green shoots of spring growth. Mrs. Peterson suggested those, Yates explained, following her gaze. Said a home needs flowers to truly be complete. I'm afraid I haven't had much luck with them. Perhaps I can help with that, Sophie offered. Yates brought the wagon to a stop before the cabin and came around to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, he surprised her by keeping hold of her hand. Welcome home, Sophie Irving, he said softly. The simple phrase, spoken with such sincerity, pierced something within her. Home. She hadn't had a true home since childhood. Yates cleared his throat. There's a tradition. He hesitated, seeming almost shy for the first time. Would you mind if I carried you across the threshold? Sophie nodded her consent, and Yates gently lifted her into his arms. She couldn't help noticing the strength in his frame as he easily bore her weight up the steps and through the door. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly spacious and orderly. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end, a sturdy table and chairs in the center, and a comfortable-looking armchair near the hearth. Open shelves held dishes and cooking implements, while a cast-iron stove stood ready for meal preparation. Everything was clean, if simple. He set her down carefully and allowed her to explore. A door led to a bedroom containing a large bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small bedside table. A second, smaller bedroom held what appeared to be Yates's work desk and bookshelves, lined with volumes more books than Sophie would have expected. I thought the second room might serve as your private space, Yates explained, at least until we become better acquainted. I can sleep on the cot in the back of the main room. His consideration touched her deeply. That isn't necessary, she began, but Yates shook his head. I meant what I said, Sophie. We have time. There's no rush for any aspect of this marriage. A question formed in Sophie's mind, one that had lingered since their first meeting. May I ask something personal? Of course. Why did you choose me? From all the responses you must have received. Yates considered her question thoughtfully. Your letter was honest. You didn't embellish or make grand promises. You wrote about wanting partnership and respect, not romance or riches. He smiled slightly. And you mentioned being practical about expectations, which I appreciated. Out here, practicality often means survival. His answer reassured her. It was grounded in reality, not fantasy. Now I have a question for you, Yates said. Why did you accept my proposal? Sophie thought carefully before answering. Your letters were kind, but not flowery. You described your life truthfully, including its hardships. You asked about my skills and thoughts, not just my appearance. She paused. And you never once mentioned wanting someone obedient. Understanding flashed in Yates's eyes, a glimpse of comprehension about what she might have endured in her previous position. Well, he said after a moment, I should unload the supplies and tend to the animals. Would you like to rest after the journey, or would you prefer I show you around the property first? I'd like to see everything if you don't mind, Sophie replied. And perhaps you could tell me about your daily routines. I want to understand how I can be useful. Yates's tour of the ranch was thorough and informative. He introduced her to the horses Thunder, his own chestnut gelding, Daisy, a gentle mare he thought might suit Sophie once she learned to ride, and Samson, the draft horse who pulled the plow and heavy wagon. The small herd of cattle numbered 22, including 6 new calves. Chickens pecked in their yard, providing eggs and occasional meat. The garden needs attention, Yates admitted, showing her a fenced plot behind the house. I managed to grow potatoes and beans, but not much else. My talents lie elsewhere. I can help with that, Sophie offered. I learned some gardening during my time in Philadelphia. As evening approached, Sophie insisted on preparing dinner from the supplies they'd purchased in town. Yates built a fire in the stove for her before returning to finish his outdoor chores, giving her time to familiarize herself with the kitchen. By the time he returned, she had a simple but satisfying meal of fried potatoes, salt pork, and biscuits ready. Yates washed up at the pump outside, returning with damp hair and clean hands to sit at the table. This smells wonderful, he said appreciatively. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Sophie spoke. Would you tell me more about your plans for the ranch? In your letters you mentioned hoping to expand. Yates nodded, clearly pleased by her interest. I'd like to double the herd within 2 years if possible. The railroad's expanding west and beef prices are strong. I'm also considering breeding horses. There's good money in providing mounts for the army and for settlers passing through. That sounds promising, Sophie said. What would that require? Investment in good breeding stock primarily, and more land eventually. He glanced at her. I should be clear we're not poor, but neither are we rich. I have savings, and the ranch turns a modest profit, but expanding means taking calculated risks. I understand, Sophie assured him. I'm accustomed to careful management of resources. After dinner, Sophie insisted on washing the dishes, despite Yates's protests that she must be tired. Working in the kitchen gave her a sense of normalcy, of establishing her place in this new home. As darkness fell, the awkwardness Sophie had been expecting finally materialized. Yates lit a lamp and gestured toward the bedrooms. I've put fresh linens on the bed in the main bedroom, he said. There's water in the pitcher on the washstand. If you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to wake me. Thank you, Sophie replied, suddenly shy. For everything today. You've been more than kind. A soft smile touched Yates's lips. Sleep well, Sophie. In the bedroom, Sophie changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed brushing her hair. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, the bedding clean and fresh-smelling. Through the thin walls she could hear Yates moving about in the main room, the creak of the cot as he settled for the night. She touched her bruised eye, which had faded to a dull yellow-purple. In the span of a single day, her life had transformed completely. She had left Philadelphia as Sophie Graham, a lady's maid fleeing abuse, and would wake tomorrow as Sophie Irving, a rancher's wife in Montana Territory. The suddenness of the change was dizzying, yet beneath her natural trepidation lay a thread of hope. Yates Irving had shown himself to be a man of his word, considerate and patient. This marriage might indeed become the partnership they had both described in their letters. With that comforting thought, Sophie extinguished the lamp and slipped beneath the quilt, falling into the first peaceful sleep she'd known in months. The days that followed established a rhythm to their shared life. Sophie rose early, preparing breakfast before Yates returned from his morning chores. They would discuss the day's tasks over coffee and biscuits, Yates detailing his plans for the ranch while Sophie outlined her intentions for the household. Gradually, Sophie began transforming the cabin into a home. She rearranged furniture to create better flow, hung curtains sewn from fabric purchased in town, and planted herbs near the kitchen door. She took over management of the vegetable garden, expanding it to include carrots, onions, and greens, while Yates taught her the basics of caring for the chickens and collecting eggs. Their interactions remained cordial and respectful, with Yates maintaining his promise to give her space and time. He continued sleeping on the cot in the main room, despite Sophie's increasingly conflicted feelings about the arrangement. Though she appreciated his consideration, she found herself drawn to his quiet strength and gentle nature in ways that surprised her. 2 weeks after their wedding, Sophie accompanied Yates into town for supplies and her first meeting with Harriet Peterson's sewing circle. While Yates attended to business at the bank, Sophie joined the group of women gathering in the Peterson home. "There she is," Harriet greeted her warmly. "Ladies, this is Sophie Irving, Yates's new wife." The women, 5 in total besides Harriet, welcomed her with varying degrees of curiosity. Sophie was acutely aware that her black eye had faded to a barely noticeable yellowish shadow, but the story behind it had clearly circulated. As they worked on their various sewing projects, Sophie had brought mending from the ranch conversation flowed naturally. The women shared news of births and illnesses, discussed the latest shipment of fabrics at the general store, and debated the merits of different preserving methods for the coming harvest season. Elizabeth Cooper, a young mother with a 3-month-old baby sleeping in a basket beside her, asked the question Sophie had been dreading. "So, Sophie, how are you finding married life?" "Yates Irving has been the territory's most eligible bachelor for years." Sophie felt all eyes turn to her. "Mr. Irving has been very kind," she replied carefully. "The ranch is lovely, and I'm enjoying learning about the land." "Just kind?" teased Margaret Wilson, the blacksmith's wife. "That's rather lukewarm for a newlywed." Heat rose in Sophie's cheeks. "We're still becoming acquainted," she said diplomatically. Harriet Peterson interceded with a knowing look. "Some of the best marriages start with friendship rather than passion," she said firmly. "My Jacob and I barely knew each other when we wed 30 years ago. The love grew steadily, like a well-tended garden." Sophie shot her a grateful glance as the conversation turned to other topics. Later, as they enjoyed tea and home-baked cookies, Harriet drew Sophie aside. "Don't mind their prying," the older woman said quietly. "They mean well, but they forget that not every marriage begins the same way." She paused. "Yates is a patient man. That patience comes from experience with loss and hardship. Whatever happened before you came here?" Her eyes flicked to where Sophie's bruise had been. "He'll give you all the time you need." "Thank you," Sophie said sincerely, "for your kindness and understanding." "We're neighbors," Harriet said simply. "That means something out here." When Yates collected her later, Sophie felt a new appreciation for the community she was joining. The women had accepted her without demanding explanations, offering friendship without conditions. As they rode back to the ranch, Sophie shared her impressions of the sewing circle. "Mrs. Peterson has invited us for Sunday dinner next week," she concluded. "I said we would be happy to attend, but I can decline if you prefer not to." "No, that would be nice," Yates replied, looking pleased. "The Petersons are good people. Jacob helped me build the barn when I first arrived." They lapsed into comfortable silence for a while before Yates spoke again. "Was it very different? Your life in Philadelphia?" Sophie considered the question. "In some ways. The city is crowded and busy compared to Opal, but service is service, whether in town or country. The days were long, the work demanding." She hesitated before adding, "The biggest difference is having choices. As a servant, my time was never my own." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Do you feel you have choices here?" The question surprised her with its perceptiveness. "Yes," she said after a moment. "You've given me freedom to organize the household as I see fit. You ask my opinions rather than dictating." His expression warmed at her response. That's how it should be between partners. That evening, as Sophie prepared dinner, she found herself watching Yates as he reviewed figures in his account book at the table. His brow furrowed in concentration, a lock of hair falling across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to brush it back. The realization startled her. This new awareness of him as not just her husband in name, but as a man she was genuinely coming to admire. Later, after they had eaten and cleared away the dishes, Yates surprised her by retrieving a book from the shelf. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, handing her a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. "My sister left it behind when she married. She said every household should have at least one good novel." Sophie accepted the book with genuine pleasure. "I've never read it, though I've heard it's wonderful. Reading wasn't encouraged in service, it was considered a distraction from duties." "We have oil to spare for the lamp," Yates said. "Read as late as you wish." That night, settled in bed with Jane Austen's world unfolding before her, Sophie felt a contentment she hadn't expected to find so soon in her new life. The novel's exploration of first impressions and gradual understanding seemed particularly relevant to her own circumstances. Spring progressed into early summer, bringing longer days and increasing warmth. Sophie's garden flourished under her care, while Yates focused on the new calves and preparations for haying later in the season. They fell into comfortable routines, working separately during the day but coming together for meals and evening conversation. One afternoon in late May, as Sophie hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Shading her eyes against the sun, she recognized Dr. Williams, Opal's physician. Yates emerged from the barn as the doctor reached the yard, greeting him with a handshake. "Doc, what brings you out this way? Not making house calls for the healthy, are you?" "Just passing by on my way back from the Thompsons' place," Dr. Williams explained, dismounting. "Their youngest had a fever, nothing serious. Thought I'd stop and check on your wife, see how she's healing up." Sophie tensed, realizing the doctor was referring to her long, faded black eye. Yates's expression remained pleasant, but she noticed a tightening around his mouth. "That's thoughtful of you, Doc, but as you can see, Sophie's in fine health." Dr. Williams turned to Sophie with a professional smile. "Mrs. Irving, good to see you again. That eye healing up nicely?" "Yes, thank you," Sophie replied politely. "It's completely better now." "Glad to hear it. If you don't mind my saying so, you're looking much improved from when you first arrived in Opal. Marriage seems to agree with you." Though his words were meant kindly, Sophie felt a flush of embarrassment. Yates stepped closer to her, his presence reassuring. "Would you like some coffee, Doctor?" Sophie offered, falling back on social conventions. "I appreciate the offer, but I should get back to town. Mrs. Williams will be expecting me." He tipped his hat. "You've got yourself a fine wife, Irving. Take good care of her." After the doctor departed, Sophie resumed hanging laundry, her movements more brisk than necessary. Yates lingered nearby, watching her with concern. "I'm sorry about that," he said finally. "People here mean well, but they can be intrusive." Sophie pinned a shirt to the line with more force than required. "It's not your fault. I just wish—" She trailed off, unsure how to express her frustration. "Wish what?" Yates prompted gently. "That I hadn't arrived looking like a victim," she finished. "That isn't how I wanted to begin my life here." Yates stepped closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Sophie, no one who knows you could possibly think of you as a victim. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." His words caught her off guard. "You hardly know me," she protested. "I know enough," he countered. "You left everything familiar behind to start fresh in an unknown place. You've adapted to ranch life without complaint. You face each new challenge with determination." His voice softened. "That's not weakness, Sophie. That's remarkable strength." The sincerity in his expression made something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly fighting tears. Sensing her emotion, Yates changed the subject. "The south pasture fence needs mending. I should get back to it before dark." Sophie nodded gratefully. Dinner will be ready at the usual time." That night, as Sophie lay awake listening to the distant call of coyotes, she found her thoughts turning repeatedly to Yates. The genuine admiration in his eyes when he'd called her strong had awakened something within her, a flicker of the woman she'd been, before Richard Blackwell had systematically undermined her confidence and ultimately resorted to violence. The next morning brought unexpected excitement. Sophie was kneading bread dough when she heard Yates call her name from outside. His tone was urgent, but controlled. Wiping her hands on her apron, Sophie hurried onto the porch to find Yates leading Daisy, the gentle mare, toward the house. "What's happened?" she asked, noting his unusual excitement. "Daisy's going to foal," he explained. "I didn't realize she was pregnant when I purchased her last fall, but the signs are unmistakable now. I've moved her to the small corral where we can watch her closely." Sophie followed him to the corral, where Daisy now paced restlessly. "How soon?" she asked, fascinated despite her limited knowledge of horses. "Hard to say exactly. Could be days, could be hours. First foals can be unpredictable." Yates studied the mare with a practiced eye. "I'd say within the next day or two, judging by her behavior." "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Just check on her when you're near the house. If you notice any changes, especially if she lies down and seems to be struggling, call for me immediately." Throughout the day, Sophie found excuses to pass by the corral, watching in fascination as Daisy circled and occasionally pawed at the ground. By evening, the mare seemed increasingly restless, lying down only to rise again minutes later. "It might be tonight," Yates said as they finished dinner. "I'll sleep in the barn to keep an eye on her." "I could help watch," Sophie offered impulsively. "We could take turns." Yates looked surprised but pleased by her suggestion. "Are you sure? It could be a long night." "I'm sure. I've never seen a foal born. I'd like to be there." With the decision made, they gathered blankets and lanterns and settled in the barn. Yates arranged clean straw in Daisy's stall and explained what to expect during the birth. His knowledge and gentle handling of the mare impressed Sophie, revealing yet another dimension to the man she was gradually coming to know. As midnight approached, Daisy's labor intensified. Sophie watched in awe as Yates guided the mare through the process with quiet words of encouragement and skilled hands. When the foal finally emerged, a spindly-legged colt with a white star on his forehead, Sophie couldn't contain her delight. "He's beautiful," she exclaimed as the newborn struggled to stand on wobbling legs. The intimacy of the moment, sharing this miracle of new life in the quiet darkness of the barn, created a connection between them that transcended their careful politeness of recent weeks. When Daisy successfully nudged her foal toward nursing. For the first time, Sophie found herself unconsciously leaning against Yates's shoulder, his arm coming naturally around her waist. Neither of them acknowledged this new physical closeness, but neither did they pull away. They remained like that, watching mother and foal in the lantern light, until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. "What will you name him?" Sophie asked as they finally prepared to leave the new family in peace. Yates looked at her thoughtfully. "I thought you might like to choose." The simple gesture entrusting her with naming the first new life to arrive since she'd come to the ranch touched Sophie deeply. "Promise," she said after a moment's consideration. "His name is Promise." Yates's smile in the dim light made her heart flutter. It suits him. Exhausted but exhilarated, they walked back to the cabin together in the early morning light. At the door, Yates paused. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said quietly. "Most women wouldn't have wanted to spend the night in a barn for a foaling." "Most women haven't had the opportunity," Sophie countered. "Thank you for not assuming I'd be too delicate for it." Their gazes held for a moment longer than usual, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with gentle courtesy, Yates stepped aside to let her enter the cabin first. The birth of Promise marked a turning point in their relationship. The shared experience had broken down some invisible barrier, allowing for greater ease between them. Sophie found herself reaching more readily for Yates's hand when walking on uneven ground, while he began to touch her shoulder or arm in casual conversation. Small gestures, yet significant in their gradual transition from strangers to something more. June brought the season's first real heat, turning the surrounding grasslands golden. Sophie adapted to the warmer weather by rising earlier to complete household chores before the day grew too hot. Yates, meanwhile, focused on repairs to the irrigation ditch that would water their hayfields through the dry summer months. One particularly warm afternoon, Sophie decided to take advantage of Yates's absence. He had ridden to a neighboring ranch to help with branding by washing her hair. She heated water on the stove, added dried lavender from her herb garden, and thoroughly cleansed her long brown hair for the first time since arriving in Montana. With Yates not expected until evening, she sat on the porch in the sunshine, brushing her hair dry in the warm breeze. The simple pleasure of the moment, the sweet-scented air, the distant call of meadowlarks, the gentle motion of the brush through her damp locks lulled her into a peaceful reverie. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon the cabin. Startled, Sophie looked up to find Yates returning earlier than expected, now motionless on Thunder, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Self-conscious suddenly, Sophie rose to her feet, one hand gathering her loose hair. "You're back early," she said, aware of how domestic, even intimate, this scene must appear. Yates dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "The Hendersons had more help than expected," he explained, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "You look different with your hair down." The way he said it with genuine admiration, rather than the possessive assessment she'd grown accustomed to from Richard Blackwell, sent warmth spreading through Sophie's chest. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I thought I had time before you returned." "Mind?" Yates echoed, leading Thunder toward the corral. "Why would I mind my wife enjoying the sunshine on our own porch?" There was a hint of something new in his tone, not just kindness or respect, but a deeper appreciation that made Sophie's pulse quicken. That evening, their conversation over dinner flowed more naturally than ever before. Yates shared amusing stories from the branding, while Sophie detailed her progress with the garden and her plans for preserving vegetables later in the summer. When their laughter mingled over a particularly funny anecdote about a stubborn calf, Sophie realized with sudden clarity how comfortable she had become in this man's presence. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Yates broached a subject they had both been carefully avoiding. "Sophie," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about our sleeping arrangements." She turned to look at him, heart suddenly pounding. "The cot isn't ideal for the long term," he continued. "With summer coming on, the main room gets too warm at night, and truthfully, my back isn't what it used to be." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you be comfortable if I moved my things into the main bedroom? I could make up a pallet on the floor, still giving you your privacy." Sophie studied his face in the fading light, the earnest expression, the careful distance he maintained even now. This good man had given her weeks of space and respect, asking nothing in return. "Yates," she said softly, "this is your home too. The bed is large enough for both of us. I trust you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Yates's expression shifted, subtly relief, mingled with something deeper. "Are you certain?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "I am." That night they navigated this new intimacy with careful consideration. Yates gave Sophie privacy to prepare for bed first, entering the bedroom only after she was settled beneath the quilt. He extinguished the lamp before changing into his nightclothes, maintaining a respectful distance as he lay beside her. "Good night, Sophie," he said quietly into the darkness. "Good night, Yates," she replied, acutely aware of his presence just inches away. Though sleep was slow in coming that first night, Sophie found surprising comfort in the sound of Yates's steady breathing beside her. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt truly safe. The shared bed did not immediately change other aspects of their relationship. Yates remained scrupulously respectful of her boundaries, careful not to presume further intimacy. Yet the simple act of sleeping side by side created a new closeness between them. Whispered conversations in the darkness, the gradual relaxation of waking to find themselves nearer than when they had fallen asleep. July arrived with blazing heat and the promise of Opal's Independence Day celebration. The entire territory would gather in town for a day of festivities, culminating in a dance at the newly constructed community hall. "We don't have to attend if you'd rather not," Yates told Sophie as they discussed the event over breakfast. "Some years I've stayed at the ranch instead." "I'd like to go," Sophie decided. "Mrs. Peterson says it's quite the occasion." Yates nodded, looking pleased. "Then we'll go. It's been years since I attended the dance." The morning of July 4th dawned clear and hot. Sophie, dressed with particular care in her best dress, a sky blue cotton with white trim that she'd altered to better fit her figure. When she emerged from the bedroom, Yates's appreciative gaze sent a flush of pleasure through her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, noting how handsome he appeared in his Sunday clothes. "You look very nice yourself." The journey to town was filled with anticipation. As they approached Opal, they could see wagons and riders converging from all directions, the small town transformed by bunting and flags. The celebration was more elaborate than Sophie had expected. Tables groaned with food brought by families from miles around, while contests of skill horseshoe pitching, shooting competitions, pie-eating races occupied the men. Children darted between adults, faces sticky with candy, while women gathered in the shade to catch up on news. Sophie found herself welcomed warmly by the women she'd met at the sewing circle, their initial curiosity having given way to genuine friendship. She contributed her own dish, a berry cobbler made with wild strawberries she'd gathered near the stream, to universal acclaim. Throughout the day, she noticed how Yates stayed attentively nearby without hovering, introducing her to neighbors she hadn't yet met and ensuring she was comfortable in the crowd. His consideration touched her deeply, especially in comparison to her previous experiences in society, where she'd been either invisible as a servant or uncomfortably exposed to unwanted attention. As evening approached, the community hall was prepared for dancing. Lanterns were lit, tables pushed back against the walls, and local musicians took their places on a small stage. Sophie felt a flutter of nervousness as Yates led her inside. She had never attended a proper dance before, having only observed such events from the margins while serving refreshments. "I should warn you," Yates said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm not the most accomplished dancer." "That makes two of us," Sophie admitted. "In Philadelphia, I watched others dance but never participated myself." "Then we'll learn together," Yates replied, offering his hand as the first notes of a Virginia reel filled the hall. Their initial attempts were awkward but joyful, both of them laughing at missteps and wrong turns. Sophie found herself relaxing into the music and movement, guided by Yates's steady presence. When the musicians shifted to a waltz, he drew her closer, one hand resting properly at her waist. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly. Sophie nodded, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Yes." They moved together more smoothly than she would have expected, finding a natural rhythm that required little thought or effort. Sophie became increasingly aware of the warmth of Yates's hand against her back, the slight pressure of his fingers, the faint scent of soap and sunshine that clung to him. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, occasionally separating to speak with neighbors or refresh themselves with lemonade. Sophie noticed more than one approving glance directed their way, particularly from older couples who seemed pleased to see Yates Irving finally partnered at the annual dance. "You two make a fine couple," Harriet Peterson commented when Sophie joined her briefly near the refreshment table. "It does my heart good to see it." "Thank you," Sophie replied, finding she meant it sincerely. The final dance of the evening was a slow waltz. Yates held her slightly closer than before, their earlier hesitation giving way to greater comfort with each other's touch. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Seeing you smile and laugh, it means more than I can say." Sophie looked up to find his gaze intent on her face, filled with something that made her breath catch. "I've enjoyed it more than I expected to," she admitted. "Being here with you makes it special." The simple honesty of her words seemed to affect Yates deeply. His hand tightened slightly at her waist as they continued to move in time with the music, the space between them diminishing with each step. As the final notes faded, neither moved immediately to break apart. For a breathless moment, Sophie thought Yates might kiss her here, in the middle of the dance floor, with the entire community as witness. Instead, he gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin. "Shall we head home?" he asked softly. The word home resonated within Sophie. Yes, the ranch had truly become her home, not just a place of refuge, but somewhere she belonged. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but charged with unspoken awareness. Stars blanketed the vast Montana sky, while a crescent moon provided just enough light to see the road. When they reached the cabin, Yates helped Sophie down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "I'll just check on the animals," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Go on in, I won't be long." Inside, Sophie lit the lamp and moved about the familiar space, her mind replaying moments from the dance, Yates's hand at her waist, the warmth in his eyes, the way they had moved together as if they'd been dancing for years rather than hours. When Yates entered the cabin, he paused in the doorway, watching her with an expression that made her heart race. Sophie stood still, suddenly certain that something had shifted between them, that they stood at the threshold of a new phase in their relationship. "Sophie," he said, removing his hat and setting it aside, "I need to tell you something." "Yes?" she prompted when he hesitated. Yates took a deep breath. "When I placed that advertisement seeking a wife, I was looking for companionship, for partnership. I wanted someone practical who could help make this ranch succeed." He moved closer, his expression earnest. "I never expected to feel what I'm feeling now." Sophie's pulse quickened. "What are you feeling?" "That I'm falling in love with you," he admitted simply. "Not because of any obligation or arrangement between us, but because of who you are, your strength, your kindness, your determination." He paused. "I don't expect you to return those feelings. I know you came here seeking safety and a new beginning, but I wanted you to know the truth of what's in my heart." His honest declaration, delivered without demands or expectations, touched Sophie deeply. This good man had offered her not just protection, but genuine respect, not just partnership, but true caring. "Yates," she said softly, taking a step toward him. "When I came to Montana, I was running away from something terrible. I didn't believe I could ever trust a man again." She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "But you've shown me what a true gentleman is, what a real partner can be." Hope flickered in his eyes. "Sophie, I care for you too," she admitted, "more than I thought possible after such a short time. You've given me space to heal, to find myself again, and in doing so, you've given me the chance to recognize what's growing between us." The joy that spread across Yates's face was beautiful to behold. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Sophie?" Properly this time, not just the brief touch we shared at our wedding. "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Please." His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, a kiss that asked rather than demanded, that offered rather than took. Sophie responded hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as warmth spread through her body. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I meant what I said when you first arrived," he murmured. "The only marks you'll ever bear in this house will be kisses." He brushed his lips lightly across her cheekbone, where her black eye had long since faded. "And only if you want them." Sophie closed her eyes, savoring his tenderness. "I want them," she assured him. "I want you, Yates Irving." That night, their shared bed took on new meaning as husband and wife truly became one for the first time. Yates's gentle patience and Sophie's newfound trust combined to create an experience of intimacy that healed old wounds and forged deeper bonds between them. As summer progressed into fall, Sophie and Yates settled into a relationship that balanced partnership with deepening love. The harvest season kept them both busy, Sophie preserving the garden's bounty while Yates and hired hands brought in the hay that would sustain their livestock through winter. In early October, as the first frost silvered the grass around the cabin, Sophie confirmed what she had suspected. For several weeks she was expecting their first child. She chose a quiet evening to share the news after they had finished dinner and settled before the fireplace. Yates was reading the newspaper from Helena, which arrived weekly with the mail rider, while Sophie worked on knitting a new winter scarf for him. "Yates," she began, setting her knitting aside, "I have something important to tell you." He lowered the newspaper, giving her his full attention. "What is it?" "I believe we'll be welcoming a new member to our family next spring," she said, her hand resting instinctively on her still flat stomach. "Around May, if my calculations are correct." For a moment, Yates looked stunned, then a smile of pure joy transformed his features. He set the newspaper aside and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "A baby," he confirmed, his voice filled with wonder. "We're having a baby?" Sophie nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears at his reaction. "Yes. Are you pleased?" In answer, Yates gathered her gently into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," he whispered against her hair. "Sophie, you've made me the happiest man in the territory. First, by becoming my wife, and now, by making me a father." They remained embraced before the fire, discussing names and plans for expanding the cabin to include a nursery. Yates insisted that Sophie's health must come first throughout the winter, promising to hire more help for the heavier chores. "I want you to rest when you need to," he told her firmly. "The baby's well-being and yours is more important than anything else." As winter descended on Montana, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glistening white expanse, Sophie and Yates found their bond deepening further. The long evenings were filled with conversation and companionable silence, Yates often reading aloud while Sophie worked on tiny garments for their child. Christmas brought a special joy as they celebrated their first holiday together. They decorated the cabin with pine boughs and berries, exchanged modest gifts, and hosted the Petersons for a festive dinner. As they sat together that night, watching the fires glow, Sophie realized how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About last Christmas," she replied honestly. "I was serving dinner to the Blackwells, wondering how I would escape." She placed her hand over his where it rested on her slightly rounded belly. "And now I'm here, with you, with our child growing inside me. It seems almost unbelievable sometimes." Yates brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles tenderly. "Not unbelievable," he corrected. "Just right as it was meant to be." Winter gradually gave way to spring, the snow melting to reveal the first green shoots pushing through the soil. Sophie's body blossomed with new life, her pregnancy progressing smoothly despite the isolated conditions. Dr. Williams visited monthly, declaring both mother and child to be in excellent health. In early May, just as the wildflowers began carpeting the plains around their home, Sophie went into labor during a gentle spring rain. Harriet Peterson arrived to assist, having been fetched by Yates at the first signs of Sophie's discomfort. After 12 hours of labor, Yates pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door, until Harriet insisted he come in to support his wife. Sophie gave birth to a healthy son, with dark hair like his father's and eyes that would eventually settle into a shade between Sophie's hazel and Yates's brown. Young Thomas Jacob Irving announced his arrival with a robust cry that filled the cabin. "He's perfect," Yates whispered as Sophie placed their son in his arms for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You're both perfect." As summer returned to Montana, bringing with it the first anniversary of Sophie's arrival in Opal, the Irving family settled into new routines centered around their son. Yates proved to be a devoted father, often wearing Thomas in a sling across his chest as he handled the lighter ranch chores, singing softly to the infant in a deep, gentle voice. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Sophie's arms, Yates broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I received a letter from the bank today," he began. "The Henderson property to the east of us is coming up for sale. Old man Henderson is moving to Oregon to live with his daughter." Sophie glanced at him with interest. "The property that borders our stream?" "The very same," Yates confirmed. 300 acres with good water rights and decent grazing land. If we purchased it, we could expand the herd significantly and start breeding horses as I've wanted to." "It sounds like an excellent opportunity," Sophie said thoughtfully. "Can we afford it?" "With the money we've saved from the cattle sales, plus a small loan from the bank, yes." Yates looked at her intently. "But it would mean tighter finances for a while, more work for both of us. I wouldn't consider it without your full agreement." Sophie considered the proposition carefully, appreciating that Yates genuinely valued her opinion on such a significant decision. "I think we should do it," she said finally. "This is our future, Thomas's future too. The opportunity might not come again." Yates's smile was brilliant. "I hoped you'd say that." He reached out to touch Thomas's downy head. "I want to build something lasting for him, for all the children we might have." "Children," Sophie repeated with a raised eyebrow. "Planning ahead, are we?" "If you're willing," Yates replied, his expression turning serious. "I know we didn't discuss family size before we married. If you'd prefer Thomas remain our only child." "No," Sophie interrupted gently. "I'd like more children in time. Perhaps a sister for Thomas next." The look of happiness that crossed Yates's face warmed her heart. He leaned over to press a tender kiss to her lips, then one to Thomas's forehead. "I love you both so much," he murmured, "more than I ever thought possible." "And we love you," Sophie replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the Montana sky. "My brave, gentle cowboy who promised me a life of kisses instead of bruises." In the years that followed, the Irving Ranch prospered and expanded. The purchase of the Henderson property proved to be the first of several strategic acquisitions that eventually made Yates one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. Sophie, with her keen mind for management, became an equal partner in all business decisions, earning the respect of even the most traditional cattlemen in the region. Thomas was joined by a sister, Clara Harriet, 2 years later, followed by another son, William, 3 years after that. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, growing strong and confident under the loving guidance of parents whose partnership served as an example to the entire community. Sophie occasionally thought of the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Opal with a black eye and little hope. That woman could never have imagined the fullness of the life that awaited her. The love of a good man, the joy of healthy children, the satisfaction of building something meaningful together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood together watching their children play in the yard of the expanded homestead that now boasted a comfortable 2-story house, Sophie turned to Yates with eyes full of gratitude. "Do you ever think about that day when I first arrived?" she asked softly. "How different things might have been if you'd been a different kind of man." Yates drew her into his arms, the embrace as secure and loving as it had been from the beginning. "I prefer to think about how things are," he replied, brushing his lips against her temple. "How much we've built together. How completely you've fulfilled every promise we made to each other." As the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sophie Irving stood encompassed in her husband's embrace, surrounded by the life they had created together, a life that had begun with a bruise, but had blossomed into something beautiful beyond measure. The only marks she had known in this home, true to Yates's first promise, had been kisses, tokens of love freely given and joyfully received.